Hello and welcome to everybody that's coming in at the moment. We're fair filling up already. We've got welcome to our sort of unconventional internationalist Burns night. We thought we'd provide something different since there's such a wealth of Burns nights this year that follow the more traditional format. So here we've got contributors from Dundee, London, New York, and Dunedin, New Zealand. All four locations share the John Steell statue of Robert Burns, first erected in New York Central Park, then in Dundee, then in London, then in New Zealand. So we've got a variety of talks. We'll finish off in about an hour and a half with some Burns poetry. But most of tonight is going to be taking the form of talks, learning something about the situation of the left in New York and New Zealand, learning a bit about the origins of the John Steell Burns statue in Dundee, and learning a bit about the need to sort of question our radical history as it's passed down to us, which is very interesting in the context of Burns and the nearby George Kinloch statue, also by John Steell. So, exciting night ahead, and thanks everybody for coming. All right, so coming up for 10 past, introduce our first speaker, Graham Ogilvy, who's a board member at the Dundee Burns Club. Correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, Graham. And Graham's going to give us a bit of history of the John Steell Burns statue, which was actually erected with funds from the Dundee Burns Club way back in the 1880s. So I'll pass over to Graham. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Okay, thanks, James. So just getting used to this format. We've had a couple of meetings at work with it, but I'm not terribly familiar with it. But anyway, yeah, thanks for that. So I'm the president of the Dundee Burns Club, which is all of about half a dozen members, but has a very ancient lineage going back to 1860, and was responsible for putting up the statue, and is one of only four, I think now, Burns clubs in the world which still has its own premises. So we're actually quite a rich wee club, which is indicative of support we've had from generations of working people in Dundee, because it was really a working class organisation founded by skilled men, artisans in 1860. And the statue in Dundee has very little to do with a romantic Burns and the Kale Yard and, To a Mouse and all that, although admirable eco expressions in To a Mouse. But do you know what I mean? It's not about the schmaltzy side of Burns. It was all to do with the democratic and radical side of Burns. And in talking about this statue, I think a wee reprise of the history, Dundee's working class history before and after it, helps us to understand why Dundee recorded the highest vote there for independence, and why it has been what Mick McGuigan called a sort of cockpit of working class struggle. The radical movement in Dundee, and indeed the movement for Scottish independence, really has its roots in the 1790s, when, in common with everywhere really across Britain, not just Scotland, there was a huge groundswell of support for the French Revolution. And in Dundee, this was very, very profound. In the east coast of Scotland in particular, it was very profound. And because we had higher literacy rates, there was a great support and demand for Tom Paine's Rights of Man. It was the first bestseller in Britain, actually. But in Scotland, it really achieved saturation levels. It was actually translated into Gaelic. And when the government banned it, It was printed in Paris and imported surreptitiously through Dundee. So we had this radical movement, which everybody did. And one of the leading lights was an Englishman called the Reverend Thomas Palmer, and who was actually an old Etonian, but a very principled and decent guy. And he, if anything, toned down some of the radical stuff that was produced by another guy called George Mealmaker. And George Mealmaker was a weaver in the Seagate. He was a very skilled weaver and a very bright intellectual man. In the John Kay's drawing of the Scottish martyrs, it's notable that George Mealmaker is pictured holding a sheaf of documents. People thought because you were a weaver, you were just illiterate and so forth, but he was not. And he wrote several pamphlets. One of them was against the coming war with France, and Palmer arranged for its publication, toned it down a wee bit, and he was arraigned and he was charged with sedition. That's to say, Palmer, and he was transported to Australia for 7 years, virtually a death sentence. He was transported with Thomas Muir, the famous advocate, and Burns wrote Scots Wha Hae about their imprisonment and martyrdom. It was an allegory. It's not to do with Wallace and all that. It's to do with these two modern Democrats getting the jail and getting transported, which people in across Scotland were horrified, and in England, where there was quite a movement in Parliament to free them. But in Scotland, you could pack a jury. They were able to. The irony was that there was a much greater popular support for democratic ideas in Scotland than there was in England. But in Scotland, it was easier for them to rig the juries than in England. So we had these terrible trials. So Mealmaker actually gave evidence and said at the trial, it wasn't him, it was me that wrote it, but they just ignored him because they had this old Etonian and a bit of a toff, and they thought, well, he's dangerous, he's a leader. But they picked on the wrong guy, really, and Mealmaker was free. And he went underground, and across Britain, they formed societies of Friends of the People. But in Dundee, they formed the Friends of Liberty. And I think that's significant, more militant, more ideological, and it began to move away from the notion of parliamentary and democratic reform in two directions. More socialist, they had ideas and plans to break up the big estates and distribute them amongst the peasants. And also, it was the very first time that a Scottish Parliament was mooted. And that's when they formed the United Scotsmen, who led an insurrection in Perthshire in 1797, and opposing the Militia Act, which was like a kind of home guard, but nobody really wanted to join it because you could join these things and end up being sent to India. So, and it was all seen about repression anyway, so people didn't want to join it. So there was a big sort of mutiny up here. So anyway, and Mealmaker was the organizer of the United Scotsmen. Every village and town around Dundee, they all had branches of it. The weavers, it was described as a society of low mechanics and weavers by the authorities. And in due course, Mealmaker was arrested and he was transported to Australia for 14 years, which was a death sentence. Nobody came back from that. We couldn't come back anyway. And along with him was a guy from Cooper, a young bloke, David Douglas, who refused to give evidence against him. And he too was transported. He got 7 years. Now, you were going to the ends of the earth. You were never going to see your family again. But Mealmaker's wife and 2 children were looked after by the radical community in Dundee, which was really big, and also in Tayside. He was a hero beyond just Dundee. Shockingly, Thomas Palmer It's commemorated in Carlton Hill on the Scottish Martyrs Monument. But Palmer, Mealmaker, and Douglas, there is no commemoration of any kind whatsoever in Dundee for them. And they all, were sent to Australia campaigning for our freedom. It's absolutely scandalous. I mean, as a boy, I was told about the Toll Puddle martyrs, but not the Scottish martyrs. We were told about Peterloo, but we were never told about the massacre at Tranent. We were told about the Cato Street conspiracy. We weren't taught about the 1820 Scottish insurrection and so much more, really scandalous. But there's no commemoration whatsoever. We've got a statue to Desperate Dan, but nothing for Mealmaker. But we do have Burns, who really, in his values and his democratic values, encapsulated the sort of humanitarian instincts. And because what happened after Dundee and Scotland in general, we had these waves of militancy followed by repression. So there was this great euphoria for the French Revolution, followed by terrible repression. And people ran away to France, they ran away to America, they ran away to Hamburg. They got exiled, they got banned from working from local authorities. So they went underground. And the tradition of organisation was always there. And it began to manifest itself in the early 19th century when one of Dundee's contributions to the English language is the word heckler, as in political heckler. And this is derived from the hecklers. They were known as the hacklers, who used to treat linen, flax, before it was spun into linen. And they were very political people. And of course, they had this history of repression and all that, and rights of man and all this sort of thing. And gradually, the working conditions were pretty hellish. Robert Burns was a flax dresser for a wee while. He was a heckler, but he couldn't stand it. It was terrible. He had to work long hours, very dusty room, warm. It was pretty grim. But it was silent. There was no machinery. You teased the flax with combs with nails in them. And so the hecklers also, it was a very strategic position in the sort of economy, because you needed the hecklers at a certain point and before the sort of flax went off. So without them, you were screwed. So they had an advantageous sort of position. So they were very, very militant. And one of the things that they organised was they wouldn't, in these big sheds, they refused to work unless they had a reader. And they had a bloke reading, usually it was a bloke, reading out to them political tracts in the newspapers of the day. So there was great discussion. And then the water in Dundee was poisonous, it was full of cholera and that. So people drank what they called sma beer, which was a beer, but it wasn't like a strong beer. It was fermented, but it was sufficiently fermented to kill the bugs, really. And the hecklers demanded, they wanted beer for this, beer for that, and made the bosses pay up. And then they had a huge strike in the 1820s, and the whole place came to a halt. And at the same time, the shipyard workers in Dundee occupied the shipyard and resolved to manufacture for themselves. Well, this was 150 years before UCS, and I think even before Robert Owen, or maybe about the same time, not sure. But anyway, so there was all this kind of history. And then, of course, in 1819, when there was the demand for reform was picking up, there was the massacre at Peterloo, which was the subject of a film a couple of years ago. Big meeting in Dundee, and the main speaker, George Kinloch, was threatened with prosecution, fled to France, a familiar route. And anyway, he ended up being, when he got pardoned, he came back and he was elected Dundee's first MP. And of course, he's the subject of the first steel statue in Dundee. So we had all this sort of radical organisation. At the same time, the unions were getting formed, but there was always a political radicalism. And in terms of the literary side of things, there was there was people who were big into poetry, and that was a big working class thing. And it was called the Republic of Letters. You know, that's how they viewed themselves in this space. So anyway, things advanced, and then we come to Chartism. And there's demand for the charter, and typically in Britain, the charter split. The Chartist movement split between moral force and physical force, and there's no surprise to learn that Dundee opted for physical force. It was more militant, and they were drilling, and they thought they could have a revolution, and they were drilling in the streets and whatnot, and they marched on Forfar, which was a bit of a sort of ignominious defeat, but they kind of petered out. But subsequently, people were all there was quite a lot of repression. There was quite a few people transported for protests and things like that. So against that background, at the same time, you had this British Empire rising, and the notion of Scottishness was getting squeezed out. We were all becoming North Britons, and in Edinburgh, you'll sometimes see a hotel called the North British Hotel, and you know this was the identity that was being sort of manufactured by the British Empire. It was becoming resented in Scotland. And Burns was seen to be an opponent of that, as well as a proponent for the honest man and woman. He was, he was asserting the Scottishness, which was getting squeezed. So that by the time we get to, there was a movement to celebrate Burns. It was all political, as I say. And in Dundee, there was another guy who was called the Reverend George Gilfillan. His church is still there at the bottom of Whitehall Crescent. And Gilfillan was very democratic, very anti-landowner, and weaponized Burns. And he published a thing called the National Burns, which was, I think, 5 or 6 volumes, 6 maybe, very handsome. But you could pay it up. And so ordinary people, you know, they could acquire these books, and they were worshipped, really. And well, he collaborated with my predecessor, the president of the Dundee Burns Club, which never ever had a big membership. It was always small, but they were radical, and they started the campaign to get a statue. And to cut the costs, they got a copy of the one that was done in New York. And it was a huge affair when they came to unveil it. There was 100,000 people in Dundee, but they came, trade unionists and tradespeople, they came from all over Tayside and Fife with their banners and that. And if you read the accounts, the Liberal MP, he gives a speech. There was hardly anybody had votes then. It was just the landowners, really. Not even the middle classes had votes. And he gives this speech, and it's punctuated with great cheers and all that at any time when Burns is quoted as an honest man's aboon his might, and any dig at the aristocracy was lauded, you know. So this was what really it was all about. It was the establishment of, it was part of that popular front for democracy that was on the go. And concurrently, Dundee had been, it was obviously an industrial centre now. The trade unions were increasing in their influence and organisation, and Dundee Trades Council was formed. And one of the first things, I was once the chairman of Dundee Trades Council, but one of the first things it did was it applied to join the First International. And there's a letter to Karl Marx from the Secretary of Dundee Trades Council applying to join in the international records in Moscow. And then the first Labour candidate that was put up in Dundee was Alexander MacDonald, or John MacDonald, I've forgotten which, who was the secretary. He was Scottish, but he was the secretary of the London Trades Council, and he was a member of the Social Democratic Federation, which was Marxist. And you know, this is the sort of direct descendants of Mealmaker, etc., if you like. And the Social Democratic Federation had quite a strong presence in Dundee, and one of their members at the time, a guy called Leslie, his nephew was James Connolly, the Irish revolutionary who was executed by the British. He lived in Dundee, Connolly, got married in Perth, lived in Dundee in St Mary's Lane, just behind Frank Chalmers' old flat in Lochie Road. And at the time when he stayed here, along with his brother, Dundee was the scene of what they called free speech fights. There was attempts to, the magistrates tried to stop the Social Democratic Federation from speaking, and unsuccessfully, and there was huge fights and mass arrests and riots and all the rest of it. And Connolly was here during that time. And then, you know, we progressed to things like the suffragette movement, when Dundee was really a hotbed of that, really leading. Norman Watson's done a great deal of work on that. And a lot of the suffragette leaders were from Dundee, and of course Churchill ultimately famously defeated, having been the MP here. But there was also some quite amazing events in Dundee prior to the First World War. There was a great upsurge of industrial militancy, and you can actually find this online. There's some footage, amazing, of the Dundee Carters strike. And that was significant because the Carters were kind of lowest of the low, and the real, you know, it really was a case of the worm turning when the Carters went on strike. But they paralysed all the mills, and all the mills came out in support of them. And the Dundee was really put under martial law. But the military and the navy had been brought in to Dundee on and off for, you know, over 100 years. And one of the things that the provost and the powers that be demanded was that Duddock Castle be turned into a barracks. And it wasn't to fight off the French or anybody else, it was to keep the workers down, basically. So then that takes us through to the First World War, where, as we know, people like Bob Stewart were conscientious objectors. And then we had the defeat of Churchill after the war, and the militancy during the 20s and 30s. And the Communist Party became significant in the town, with Bob Stewart, one of its first leaders coming from Dundee, former councillor in Dundee, very revered person in Dundee for his work with the unemployed, etc. And well, then the spectre after the war, the Second War, we're going to get homes fit for heroes and all that, had been reneged on in the First War, and now we were going to get it, and we got the welfare state. The Communist Party had a mass movement doing squatting right across Britain and London, and certainly in Dundee, where people were living in shop windows. It was pretty grim, and people like Dave Bowman, who was one of the communist leaders in Dundee, organised the squatting movement. And the Communist Party became quite powerful and significant, especially in the trade unions in Dundee. So I think at one point there was about 12 full-time officials in Dundee for the various unions, and 8 of them were communists. And we had about 1,000 members, and the YCL, which I was the secretary, had about 120. And I feel that we were all part of that Marxist tradition that really began pre-Marx with the Mealmaker, etc. But the nationalist thing it was always sort of discussed in terms of was John Maclean right? But I remember in 1974 on the first referendum, a lot of us opposed devolution because we thought it was really a distraction from the class struggle, you know. And a lot of us have been reluctant ever since. And but now I feel things are changing, and it's a very interesting time. But the Burns democratic, rebellious, anti-landowner, pro-working class, pro-Scottish message has lasted throughout the ages. And I think, you know, when I see Burns looking across the square at DC Thompson's and their putrid factory of lies and havers, I think it was a great thing that was done to put that statue up, and I think his values will go forward. And I hope, in some measure, that I've tried to explain why it might be that Dundee is now the yes city in Scotland and is a rebel city, because it was always a rebel city.
Many thanks for that, Graham. That was an incredible amount of history that you managed to condense into 20 minutes there. It really was. So originally I thought we'd have discussion in between the speakers, but I'm actually thinking there's far too much to discuss. So I think maybe we're better going through the speakers and then saving the discussion for the end. But yeah, there's just so much to ask there. I know even myself would have too many questions. So I think we'll go straight on to Frank Chalmers, who's from Dundee but lives down in London, who's recorded a song for us, an original song about Scottish independence from the viewpoint of England and how it can perhaps bring Scotland and England together in some sense.
Okay, well, let me put that in context.
No problem, Frank.
Yeah.
On you go.
I mean, my family celebrate Burns because he was a champion of democracy. He was a radical poet, as Graham said. He wanted change, not just for the people of Scotland, but for everybody throughout the world. And these were dangerous views to have in Burns' time. If you look at the context of Burns' poetry, there were only about 3,000 people in the whole of Scotland who were allowed to vote. They were all men, and they could all be bought at a price that would ensure their votes supported what was a really despotic government in London. And of course, there was no Scottish Parliament to stand up for people. So at that time, you'd think that would be quite an easy divide between Scotland and England, that Scotland was good and England was bad. But Graham mentioned all the working class history, but Burns hated the fact that Scotland had lost its independence. And he wrote, "What force or guile could not subdue through many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few for hireling traitors' wages. The English steel we could disdain, secure in valor's station, but English gold has been our bane, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." Now, he was talking about the rogues being in Scotland. And I think that's why the radical independence movement, the radical view of independence is really important. Otherwise, you're not identifying the issues that do exist, the class issues in Scotland. You're only seeing it as a problem of Scotland against England or Northern Ireland against Great Britain. And I've lived in England for 40 years. I've led unemployment marches. I've led demonstrations to support the NHS. I've been in so many working class struggles that I feel a lot in common with working class people in England. And I would hate for us to lose that if we see the site only in terms of throwing off English rule. So that's why I wrote this song a couple of days ago for this. You'll be the first guys to hear it, because I try to sum up why, how do we look at it if we get independence, what happens afterwards. And if you can play the song now, Connor, we'll see how it sounds on the video. Now, Robert Burns wrote hundreds of songs, thousands of poems about people, about places, about countries, about relationships, about breaking up, about getting together, about self-determination. And this could be about any of these. It's a new song, not by Burns, but it's in the spirit of Burns. It's called Independence Day. Hi there, it's great to see you again. I hope you're feeling the same way. Seems an age ago we were together back then, but it's good to have a shared history. Bet that's something you never thought you'd hear, but we had times no one can take away.
and we shouldn't let our memories disappear. Now we share our Independence Day. Now we share our Independence Day. Looking back, it's much easier to see all the things we both did wrong. I wouldn't let you place any blame on me. Maybe why we've been distant for so long. I admit I sometimes acted selfishly. Maybe you're now thinking the same way. But if we're friends again, I hope there's lots to say. Now we share our Independence Day. Now we share our Independence Day. You said I had attitude, I just couldn't wait to call it a day. But you were full of platitudes, that's maybe why I pulled away. I felt you were taking advantage. You maybe thought the same about me. You said I'd struggle without you, but that's a risk people take to be free. I think it's really good that we've been able to meet. Maybe we just needed time apart, standing tall on our own 2 feet. Different now, we've made a fresh start, and it's more than pages on a calendar, or days and weeks in a diary. And if we're friends again, I hope there's lots to say. Now we share our Independence Day. Now we share our Independence Day. Now we share our Independence Day.
Yeah.
So you get that. You get the.
Oh, such a brilliant song. Love that. That should be number one when we do get our Independence Day. It's such a lovely thought that in years to come we could all celebrate it together. England, Wales, Scotland. It's beautiful. So thanks for that, Frank.
Okay,
Really
thank you.
appreciate you putting that together for us. So next up we've got Séamus McGuigan in New York. Going to talk a bit about the situation on the left there, maybe a bit about the Scottish history in New York. I know that many Scots always find it surprising when they see the Burns statue in Central Park. It's quite amazing. So over to you, Séamus.
All right, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, James. Really appreciate it. So my name's Séamus. I've been living, I'm originally from Glasgow, grew up, born and raised in Glasgow, but I've been living here in New York for the last 7 years since I came from my undergraduate. Apologies if this kind of discussion is going to be a little bit disjointed. I've kind of just like brought it together in the last few hours. But it's my intention that I'll give some of the history surrounding the sort of the background, the circumstances around the erection of the Burns statue here. And then I'll try and kind of connect that to a discussion of some of what's going on in terms of politics on the left in New York City right now, and maybe a little bit of a poem at the end if I have time. So as James said, the Burns statue in Central Park was the first Burns statue of the steel statues to be erected. It was put up in 1888 by the St Andrews Society to accompany the statue of Sir Walter Scott, which sits directly across from it. In the intervening years, a bunch of other statues to literary figures have popped up in that same area of the park. It's now known as the Literary Walk. The St Andrews Society that put the statue up was founded as a fellowship of Scots and the descendants of Scots in New York City around about 20 years before independence. It's actually the oldest existing institution of charity in the city. And its history is very much intertwined with the legacy of Scots in the United States in organizing finance capital in the early years of the United States. I'm sure that the great contradiction in the fact that this tribute to a man who was such a tribune of the poor, of the workers, of the downtrodden, was financed and put up by men who had made their money in exploitation and finance capital. But those parallels and those contradictions very much mirror the history of Scottish immigration to this city. You can see it in the 18th century when groups of Scottish immigrants who arrived, Scots who arrived as Jacobite rebels, who were transported as essentially indentured labor, not even essentially, as indentured labor, as effectively as quasi-property after the failed uprisings in 1715 and 1745, mixed and arrived at around about the same time as the insurgent merchant classes. And then in the 19th century, wage laborers who arrive after the clearances live and thrive in the shadows of these great civic temples that were constructed by oligarchs and monopolists like the Carnegies, like Carnegie and Morgan. And then in the 20th century, and more recently, there was another influx of bankers and business people who arrived in the city during the financial boom after deregulation of finance capital in the 1980s. They arrived around about the same time as groups of artists, and especially a lot of queer artists, who arrived to participate in the cultural milieu of the city and to find refuge in what were at the time relatively safe communities downtown in Manhattan. The St Andrews Society is still very, very active in the city. They actually organize the annual Tartan Week, which is one of the most I mean, if there is a cultural cringe, that is very much the definition of the cultural cringe. It's almost an expression of the cultural cringe. And it's a great event, not so much to celebrate Scottish culture, but it certainly celebrates Scottish business. Every year there's an influx of whatever finance secretary from the Scottish government, various people involved in investment bodies from the Scottish government who come here to mingle and make deals. Which very much supersedes the sort of surface level cultural event that it has become. It very much doesn't reach the same sort of level as, for example, the St. Patrick's Day weekend or things like that. The other cultural, or even the Puerto Rico Day, or other sort of festivals of nationality that exist in the city. It also should be noted that the St Andrews Society has a very conservative tinge. To illustrate how conservative that is they've only actually admitted female members since 2010. It was a long, protracted battle to get them to allow women to take part in the society. So at the time that the Burns statue was erected, the society was led by a Blantyre-born investor going by the name of John Stuart Kennedy. Kennedy was the co-founder, along with the Dundee-born financier Robert Fleming, of the Scottish American Investment Company, which still exists actually to this day. It manages a fund of around about $50 billion and owns the LIT Ranch in Texas, which is one of the largest cattle ranches in the world. I think it's actually based in Edinburgh, but it has offices downtown here in New York as well. He made colossal amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars in modern terms, in a railroad and land speculation. Was a prominent member of the so-called Jekyll Island Club, or the Millionaires Club, which included people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller. The railroad boom, which was actually a state-subsidized initiative, not so much a market-driven phenomenon that is presented as in the history, was one of the decisive factors in leading the settlement of the West, and the subsequent seizure of most of the remaining native lands was the product of this. After the original Trail of Tears in the late 18th and early 19th century, this was the final nail in the coffin of native sovereignty over land in the West. And this industry, along with cattle, were industries where developments were largely led by Scottish immigrants. One of the railroads that Kennedy helped finance and operate serves to bring produce from that land out west to market in New York City, the main hub of which is Hunts Point Market, which brings me from the history of this statue to the present day situation of the left in the city. It's been largely underreported even in the media over here, but the United States is actually in the midst of one of the most active periods of industrial action in recent history. One of the most interesting developments in this regard has been the strike this month of hundreds of Teamsters up at the Hunts Point Market. This is a market that distributes the vast majority of fresh produce, fruit, vegetables, meat, fish, that ends up in grocery stores and restaurants in the city, and is the largest facility of its kind in the world, supplying food to almost 22 million people every day. The members of Teamsters Local 202 voted to go on strike for the first time in 35 years last Sunday after negotiations with management broke down over the union's request for a $1 an hour raise in their new contract. In the midst of the pandemic, which has, as I'm sure you've seen from the news, has hit New York City incredibly hard. These workers have kept the city fed, despite even enduring the loss of 6 of their comrades to COVID early last year. These people are, I'm sure we'd all agree, the definition of essential workers. Nevertheless, management, which is made up of the sort of a perversely named a cooperative of the vendors who this facility service, have been receiving millions of dollars in forgivable PPE loans from the federal government, yet only offered their workers a raise of 32 cents, which the union quite correctly described as a slap in the face. So the last few weeks have seen the Teamsters picketing the market, a great victory of which came when a train full of stock arriving on one of Kennedy's own railroads was turned back to Ohio after the union engine driver refused to cross a picket line. There was a particularly concerning moment last week when 300 New York City riot police, stormed the picket lines and arrested 5 people on the rather dubious charges of obstructing traffic. This represents, I think, quite a disturbing escalation in the city's crackdown against organized labor. It's one that we have not seen for quite a while in this city. The police has obviously in the United States always been quite resistant to organized labor, but recently they've not really found cause to physically intervene in that process. So here in New York, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I am a member, along with various Black liberation and anti-fascist groups, have been instrumental in organizing solidarity with the strike. They've been delivering supplies and organizing bodies to cover the night shifts. We've seen teachers, cleaners, service workers fill in the holes on the picket line. It's been very inspiring. These actions have included a visit from DSA member and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who skipped inauguration festivities earlier in the week to deliver coffee and words of solidarity to the picket line. As of last night, I'm happy to report that the union has declared victory in this strike and will receive their new contract tomorrow, which will likely include the $1 raise. But this intersectional alliance that has formed between Labour, DSA political infrastructures, horizontalist, anti-racist and anti-fascist groups, I think reflects well the urgency for collective and collaborative approaches to labour organising in an increasingly globalised world. Capital is no longer restricted by borders or identities. Our resistance should therefore not be restricted either. In an integrated world of just-in-time supply chains, power increasingly lies in the hands of workers who work at the choke points of critical infrastructure like Hunts Point. International solidarity, which I think we see on display tonight, and the exchange of tactics, histories and theories between workers all over the world, and the coordination of our actions will be the critical tools in the future of the labour struggle. Internationalism is, of course, a value deeply ingrained in Burns's work. His exhortation that in the future a time would come where man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that is very much workers of the world unite before the fact. It is incredibly encouraging, I think, that so much of the discussion on the left of the independence movement in Scotland is so grounded in this tradition of international working class solidarity. So looking forward a little bit from the perspective of the left in the United States, as I'm sure you're aware, we're now facing a new administration, which is certainly not certainly not as ambitious or as radical as many of us here were hoping for. But now we find ourselves very much having to do two tasks, well, more than two tasks, but two tasks with regard to the Biden administration, which is to hold it account to the rather measly promises that it has made, but making sure that those are delivered, while pushing for more radical change, which will certainly come from the outside, and very much Labour will be the driving force behind that pressure. We also are challenged with resisting the right wing now after Trump. I think that the siege of the Capitol building a few weeks last week shows the rise in a sort of an organized street fascism within the United States. New York is very much a liberal city, but there is a significant right-wing presence. Several of the Proud Boys who were arrested after that event were arrested in New York City. So what becomes of this and the ways to resist it will become a key concern of the left, as well as countering what will be the Biden administration's strategy of expanding the security state, which will, of course, impact leftists just as much as it will impact the far right. We're dealing with the COVID fallout here in New York. We have a wave of evictions about to start. There are ongoing rent strikes. At the high point of the rent strikes last year, around about May Day, there were 100 tenant groups in buildings across the city who took part. So we need to now be pushing for a radical recovery that reorientates our economy more towards workers' needs and combats gentrification, which is a problem present in, I'm pretty sure, every city around the world these days, especially in Scotland, I've noticed. As far as big political events, the end of this year we'll see city council races and the mayoral race for finally get to replace the nation's most useless mayor, Bill de Blasio, who has been an absolute disgrace in the last year, the way he's conducted himself as opposed to a liberal Democrat. He has unflinchingly stood at the side of the most extravagant excesses of the police brutality in the city over the last year. He has defended it to the hilt, so it'll be good to see him gone, although it's not necessarily guaranteed that what will replace him will be much better. A significant part of this, of course, will be the DSA's electoral push. We have endorsed a slate of 6 candidates, all of whom are running openly as socialists and stand a good chance of winning for the significant power that the New York City Council holds, especially over civilian control and defunding of the New York City Police Department. So I'd like to end with a couple of verses from my favorite Burns poem, A Man Was Made to Mourn, which ironically, which was also Andrew Carnegie's favorite Burns poem, which I think is quite ironic. Not only, it's ironic referencing Carnegie, not only because of, Burns's own messages about the exploitation of the working man, when Carnegie was so responsible for so much exploitation, particularly of railway and steel workers in the United States. It's also ironic considering that Carnegie despised Steele's depiction of Burns in the statue here in New York. He described it as depicting Burns in the form of a humpbacked simpleton. Indeed, he actually hated the statue here so much that when he was making a contribution to the Burns Monument in Montrose, he specifically insisted that the artists deviate as far as possible from Steele's representation as they could. He said it was the paragon of bad taste, the depiction in Steele's statue. I think that this poem is one that reflects quite well the loss and grief that has accompanied the rise of industrial capital in Burns's time, and is now being repeated in workplaces across the world in our own time in the age of COVID. The sun that overhangs yon moors out spreading far and wide, where hundreds labour to support a haughty lordling's pride. I've seen yon weary winter sun twice 40 times return, and every time has added proofs that man was made to mourn. Many and sharp the numerous ills interwoven with our fame. more pointed still we make ourselves regret, remorse, and shame. And man whose heaven erected face the smiles of love adorn, man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn. If I'm designed yon lording slave, by nature's law designed it, but why was an independent wish e'er planted in my mind? If not, why am I subject to his cruelty or scorn? Or why has man the will and power to make his fellow mourn? Thank you very much, everybody.
Very good.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent talk, Séamus. Thanks very much for that. I had no idea about some of the details there about contemporary politics in New York, or about Carnegie's contempt for the Burns statue. I did put in the event description Murdo MacDonald's description that says that John Steell was in a category with Tishon and Hokusai. So quite a range of opinion on these statues. Hunchback, Simpleton, or Masterpiece, who knows? But thanks very much for that. It was great. And next I'm going to pass over to Dr. Erin Farley, works in the local history department at the Central Library in Dundee, who's going to talk to us a bit more about radical poetry in Dundee, featuring some James Young Geddes, my personal favourite of all the Dundonian poets. So pass over to you, Erin.
Hello. So yeah, as well as it's kind of more just me putting the boot into poor old George Kinloch for 10 minutes rather than a particular history of radical poetry. But as you mentioned, I am starting off with a reference to James Young Geddes and his wonderful poem, The Glory Has Departed, which was written on the occasion of Dundee getting its city status in 1888. And in this poem, Geddes calls on Steele's statue of Burns to come down from his plinth in Albert Square and wake up to the city's politicians kind of taking his radical name in vain. And, you know, he shouts, "Here you, Burns, stargazing opposite lambs, turn your neck this way. You know, come and see the people that raise statues to you, singing a man's a man for all that and craning their necks for honours." But earlier in the poem, Geddes invokes what he calls the true radical spirit of Dundee from the other side of Albert Square, mine own town where the tree of liberty was planted, town where Kinloch stands menacing even yet in bronze unjust governments, dear old town. And perhaps Kinloch and his radical history could have done with a wee bit of a wake-up call as well. So Kinloch, as we've heard, is another Steele statue, and he came to his plinth in 1872 after decades of on and off campaigning from people in Dundee. Even the angle of the statue was hard fought for. Matthew Jarin has written a wonderful account of how the council wanted the statue facing one way, but the Kinloch fans wanted his finger to be pointing wrathfully towards the nearest government building. And that happened to be a post office. So like the idea of Kinloch just threatening this post office is a lovely image, but even better, sort of before the statue was fixed in place, every night his supporters would come to Albert Square with ropes and they would haul the statue around in the direction they wanted it. And every morning the council's team would just haul it back. And this went on for quite a while. But what does Kinloch symbolise? And to the people who demanded the statue, and clearly to Geddes as well, he was a powerful figure. He was a symbol of reform and of Dundee's radical tradition. And he was a romantic exile who sacrificed the comfort of his aristocratic life to defend the rights of the people because he loved his land and his people more than his comfort. And people painted him as a reluctant politician, sort of pulled into the spotlight by his unshakable principles when he would rather have been tending the land in his native Howe of Strathmore. And Kinloch, sort of these myths clung to him in life, and they were intensified by the fact that he died only a few years after becoming Dundee's first MP. He didn't have the chance to live long enough to dispel them with just years of ordinary politicianhood. And again, as Graham sort of alluded to earlier, the big moment that started Kinloch's political life was in November 1819, he was invited to speak to a demonstration on the Magdalen Green, which was demanding extension for the franchise, but also justice for the victims of Peterloo. And he was invited by the organisers because he'd been writing a farming column in the Dundee Advertiser, in which he made it quite clear that he was sympathetic to the radical cause. And Kinloch was a very good speaker. And I think he might have even surprised himself reading between the lines in some of his accounts by how well his speech went down. And he accused the government of treason against its people. This was inspiring enough to get him sentenced to deportation to Australia. But because Kinloch was lucky enough to have resources and contacts at his disposal, he escaped to France. And he laid low there until the danger of this being enforced was past. And when this happened, the people of Dundee embraced him wholeheartedly as a figurehead for the cause of reform. And there's an incredible amount of poems and songs which come up sort of painting this light as an exile. And I'm afraid you're going to have to take my word for it, because we would be here all night if I start quoting all these poems. But they're sort of appearing on broadsides and in newspapers, and probably very live around the streets as well. And as I mentioned, a few years after he came back to Scotland, franchise reform resulted in Dundee getting its own MP in 1831, and he was a very popular choice for this. And I have to note that his main competition was a neighbouring landowner who had an estate like kind of right next to his own estate, and this was a more common or garden Tory variety laird. And this says a lot about the actual dynamics of Parliament at the time, that's your two choices. You can have one laird or the other laird. And the real Kinloch is quite hard to get at. He did leave diaries and papers, but to the best of my knowledge, I think these are still in private family ownership. So there's one biography of him published in the 1970s by Charles Tennant that sort of draws on these, and the author was connected to the Kinloch family. I believe that's how he got access. But the most striking thing about the popular celebrations of Kinloch is the way that they paint him as being of the land and thus of the people. And there's songs lamenting his exile, phrase hame in his fields, as if these were fields he was working with his own hands. But if you come who owns a large estate on the Angus-Perthshire border, the chances are that the money you use to escape to France has come on the back of somebody's exploitation. Certainly the Scottish peasants who were working, but of course in 18th century Scotland, this spread further afield as well around the globe. An uncle of George Kinloch owned a slave plantation in Jamaica, and Kinloch did reap the benefits of this, at least indirectly. So George Kinloch MP is listed on University College London's database of slave owners, but it does seem that there's a possibility they have mixed him up with his father of the same name. His father directly inherited the riches from the plantation from his brother, John Kinloch. And it's quite hard to kind of get at all this because of the paperwork not really being available in the public domain. But either way, it does seem that family money derived from slavery, possibly a generation removed, is a large part of what gave Kinloch the platform to become the radical laird. And it gave him the independence to escape from punishment in a way that the working class activists, people like Mealmaker, who were leading the reform campaign, certainly could not do in their lifetimes. So Kinloch, he may not have purposefully courted this mythic status in the first place, but he knew that his image as a man of the land and the people really worked for him, and he did encourage it. So there was a public dinner held in his honour in 1833, and there he quotes, of course, Burns, and he quotes "A man's a man for all that." But he also recites the song "Argyll is my name," which is about a man of high standing who nevertheless wants nothing but a simple rural life and bannocks of barley meal for his tea. So, I mean, I guess encouraging good publicity is not the worst thing that a politician has ever done, and we can't be too hard on him for that. During last summer's Black Lives Matter protests, Kinloch did appear on the Topple the Racists list of statues connected to slavery. And as well as the usual sort of myriad terrible takes about how questioning statues is just erasing history, we did see some more more interesting defences of the statue in Kinloch's memory, which brought up that Kinloch was an abolitionist in his own politics. And kind of the main bit of evidence, as far as I can see for this, is that so there was an 1831 speech Kinloch gave where he declared himself to be an enemy of slavery in all its forms, but the only thing he really committed to was saying that he would vote for the gradual abolition of enslaving Black people. And that's not really the passionate defence of human rights that the subject and his track record called for, even by the standards of the time, and it hardly qualifies him for a place in the Abolitionist History Hall of Fame. So Kinloch is kind of neither a sort of traditional slave owner figure, but he's not a sort of shining radical hero either, really. I don't doubt that he sort of genuinely did support the extension of the franchise and better conditions for workers, but I do strongly suspect that, like most politicians with financial concerns, he preferred the idea of improving the workers' conditions when it didn't have any material effect on his own comfort or income. But he certainly made the most of it, and he was a politician, and he was very good at the game of politics. And Kinloch's death was met with laments from Dundonians and from those much further afield, saying that we would never see his like again. And I would suggest that, you know, we don't have any shortage of politicians in Dundee and further afield who kind of attach themselves to one principled cause and then spend the rest of their career sort of resting on these radical laurels and coasting on the votes without really understanding the wider picture or examining the need for a more universal liberation. And Kinloch was certainly a very useful figurehead for the reform campaign at the time, having that legitimacy of a sort of respected landowner figure was very useful in furthering their cause. And I can hardly blame them for doing everything they could to get the benefit of that. But, you know, in these times when we are kind of questioning not only our sort of history of slavery in Scotland, but our sort of relationship with land ownership, maybe this is time to start questioning narratives that say we will be saved from the top down in society. And I would say we would do a lot better to learn our radical history more closely from the workers who celebrated him in the first place, the people who gave him his place in history in the first place, and the people who made Dundee and its radical history. There are plenty of heroes yet whose names we still don't know. And we have a very good question as well from Alan Armstrong about a mealmaker possibly escaping to Hamburg. So that is possibly the case, actually. I can't remember off the top of my head. Graham, you could probably confirm that.
Well, you're still muted, Graham. You're still muted, Graham.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
No, I don't know. Mealmaker didn't escape to Hamburg, but some of the United Scotsmen did. Angus Cameron and James Mingus, who led the insurrection in Strathtay in 1797. And they were all inspired by Burns, by the way. Burns was the Bob Dylan of the protest movement in Scotland for democratic reform. And it's it's a nice irony because, of course, Bob Dylan claims that he was inspired by Burns, but Angus Cameron and James Mingus did escape. They led a party of Highlanders who were opposed to the Militia Act. They were members of the United Scotsmen, and one of them got to Hamburg, the other one got to America. There was a number of the United Scotsmen went to Hamburg, but I don't think Mealmaker was one of them. He was actually arrested with his brother in Arbroath and spent a month in the clink in Arbroath in pretty terrible conditions. And he wrote a very fiery denunciation of how he was looked after. But I mean, one of the interesting things when we looked for examples of women entering the struggle was that during this anti-militia riots which swept Scotland, the reason they did this, just to emphasise, was the Black Watch had been raised in 18 whatever it was, much earlier, 17 rather, 1739 or something, very early. The Black Watch had been raised as a local militia, and they'd been promised that they wouldn't be sent abroad. But of course, no sooner did they join up than they were sent abroad. And the Black Watch mutinied on the way down to England. And some of them were taken to the Tower of London, and some of them were executed. And the monument in Aberfeldy is said to be of one of the Black Watch soldiers, Farquharson, who was executed. So nobody wanted to join this bloody dad's army because it was going to end up, you could have been anywhere, and it was principally to be used against the working people. But anyway, the point about the women is that of all the actions, and there was many, in Blairgowrie, the Lord Lieutenant of the county was captured, held for about 2 days. They captured Blair Athol Castle, Castle Weem. There are about 12,000 in this insurrection that were never thought of course. But in Errol, between Dundee and Perth, there was a protest, and the Redcoats lined up to fire on the villagers, but the women got in between the protesting men, and they charged the Redcoats, and they seized the firing pins from their muskets and threw them away. And it's a very interesting example of sort of empowerment of women at a very early stage. That was 1797. So, but yeah, Mealmaker, I'm afraid, did not escape. He was here. He died he was taken out to Australia. I've done some research. It's amazing, really. Online you can find there was a diary of an officer who was on the same boat as him. They were all really crapping themselves about Mealmaker and them. They thought Mealmaker was organising a mutiny and that they were going to get chucked over the side. But a third of the people on the boat going out died, including the officer who kept that diary. And Mealmaker survived. He introduced weaving to Australia because he was very skilled at that, and that provided employment for women convicts. And but unfortunately, there was quite an enlightened governor, relatively enlightened governor, and they built this weaving shed, but it burnt down, and the new governor had no time for Irish rebels or Scotch rebels. And there was, of course, Irish rebel activity, and they tried to implicate Mealmaker as part of that. And in fact, the new Governor General, sadly, was Captain Bligh of the Mutiny on the Bounty. So he was a real proto-fascist, and I'm afraid that Mealmaker died in the gutter. But there is a wee headstone to Mealmaker in Parramatta in New South Wales. There's nothing in Dundee. But that's my understanding. And he was so popular, I might say, that there was a huge petition launched to bring him back. And they got 16,000 signatures. And petitions were serious in those days. People had to swear in and record this. And Lord Liverpool, who was the Home Secretary then, he stated that on the receipt of this petition, he had to make a statement in Parliament, and he stated that Mealmaker had died the year before of alcoholic suffocation. But there's never been any indication of that. But he might say that, wouldn't he? But Mealmaker essentially died in poverty, destitute, but having been a very, very charismatic and talented man, having written the political and moral catechism of man, having written that leaflet, which is fantastic. If you read it today, it's like Tony Blair and the Iraq War, and this was about the French War. And he also wrote the Constitution and Principles of the United Scotsmen. And I might say that the liaison officer between the United Scotsmen and the United Irishmen was a chap from Perth called Bobby Sands. A wee bit of an irony there, but they
Sorry
had
to interrupt, Graham. I think we could maybe come back to that in the discussion, but I'm conscious of time, and we do have one more speaker. But yeah, I'm definitely come back to that. Really interesting, and I'd like to thank Erin again for that talk. That was great. I was asked by a courier journalist about the Kinloch statue back in May during lockdown. Right beside the Burns statue, actually, I was cornered. And I didn't really know the full details at that time. So what I said then was, they absolutely should be, Dundee University should be funding a full research project into Kinloch to actually get the full story of his views on abolition and his political legacy. Because, I mean, people argue Henry Dundas was an abolitionist. So one statement against slavery isn't really tantamount evidence that he was right on. So I think that still stands. It's definitely something that needs to be investigated. And if it does prove that the links to slavery are legitimate, I say topple the statue like all the rest. But that's a contentious issue, of course. So I'd like to introduce our last speaker. Very kindly, our comrades from the International Socialists of Otipoti, Dunedin, have agreed to come and talk to us tonight about the political situation in New Zealand. Dunedin was partially founded. One of its founding fathers was Robert Burns's nephew. So I think that's an indication of the sort of imperial questions that are bound up in a discussion of the legacy of Burns. So yes, I'd like to pass over to Brandon Johnstone from Dunedin.
Kia ora, team. Good morning from the very bottom of the world down here. What is it, 9:20 in the morning here? Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. This is a really cool initiative. And I'm happy to sort of represent our organization and Dunedin here. So this might be a little bit of a left turn from the sort of discussions we've been talking about so far, but still within the realm of independence and sovereignty from something of a different angle. So I'll just jump into what I've got here. Kia ora koutou, my name is Brandon Johnstone, a member of the International Socialist Organization here in Otipoti, Dunedin. While I don't identify as a Scot, my ancestry is overwhelmingly Scottish. I descend from an ancestral background of mixed morality, to put it lightly, including East Indian trading officials, but also early slavery abolitionists in the Great British Parliament. Personally, I'm a socialist because I refuse to be the sort of evil ancestor in my descendants' family tree. And because socialism from below is our greatest tool in preventing bastards like my flavor ancestors from rising again. But anyway, I introduced our organization as residing in Otipoti, Dunedin. Otipoti, to be clear, is the Maori name for Dunedin. That is the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The origin of the name of Otipoti is mostly unknown, but it was probably a name given to a boat landing spot in the harbour. The name Dunedin comes from the Scottish Gaelic name for Edinburgh, Dunedin. In fact, the original city plan for Dunedin was literally the city plan of Edinburgh, just plonked down somewhere else, which is actually why Dunedin is home to the steepest street in the world. The planners did not cut the Dunedin hills. Like much of New Zealand, the Otago region where Otipoti Dunedin lies was settled by indigenous Māori people for centuries before the arrival of European settlers. I mention this because support for indigenous struggle and recognizing land and sovereignty struggles as class struggle is core to our organization's politics. Like in much of the colonized world, indigenous people in Aotearoa New Zealand were swindled en masse out of land, in some cases imprisoned, used as slaves to build part of Otipoti Dunedin. Land theft and the refusal to recognize Māori sovereignty is the core of a great deal of intergenerational poverty in this country. Māori were dispossessed of their land and over time were forced into urban environments, becoming part of the machinery of capitalism, generally as cheap labor. The capitalist drive to satiate the public's demand for indigenous inclusion generally results in consultation with indigenous capitalists who can be used as tokens. Māori socialists generally point out the class divide exists within Māoridom too. Māori capitalists and corporate iwi, that is tribal leaders, have no interest in achieving true sovereignty for working class Māori. The broader New Zealand left, similar to the left in most Western countries, is small and pretty fragmented. Our country is small and our population density is very low, so it's fair to say that this problem is exacerbated for us. The number of truly active anti-capitalists involved in socialist organization probably only numbers in the hundreds. But they also punch above their weight and generally have a presence at any large protest or demonstration. The ISO Otipoti Dunedin is a branch of the nationwide International Socialist Organization. With about 3 dozen active revolutionaries, we are one of the largest and most active socialist organizations. I believe only outnumbered by a single broad sort of pan-leftist group here. That said, with one of the worst housing crises in the Western world, and with the relentless march of climate collapse, general political thought seems to have drifted left over the last few years, and people are becoming more susceptible here to left-wing thought. As we are largely a propagandist organization due to our size, this is promising for chipping away at the hegemony of capital. Of course, parliamentary reformist thinking absorbs much of this potential revolutionary energy. Liberal darling Jacinda Ardern has a massive following of liberals, centrists, and conservatives, and has more political capital than ever after our Labour government handled the COVID-19 crisis in New Zealand admirably. But she refuses to spend this capital on anything that would help workers while hurting capital and landlords. The party calls itself Labour while serving capital and throwing scraps to workers to keep their political base happy. In Parliament, the Labour government faces pressure from the left from our Green and Māori parties. The left opposition is intoxicating to many radicals and absorbs a lot of external pressure into the parliamentary system. Outside of Parliament, our trade union movement faces a lot of internal contradictions. Unions have sort of been brought within the machinery of capital while still fighting alongside class lines. Industrial action has skyrocketed over the last few years, winning desperately needed gains in working conditions and pay. Our comrade down here, committed trade unionist Angus Wilson, has prepared a summary of the contemporary trade union movement in the south of New Zealand, which I'll read out now. Union knowledge and appreciation varies wildly between the generations, especially amongst trade and service workers in this region. This can be partly understood given the historical conservatism of the region and its perception of being self-reliant from the latte sippers up north. This prevailing attitude, coupled with an attitude of not wanting to cause trouble and a cabal of bosses more than willing to exploit this politeness, makes the Deep South a challenge to organize effectively. This trend has been shifting across New Zealand, however. The COVID lockdowns showed workers just how vulnerable they can all be if the delicate conditions in which capitalism survives changes even a little. Job losses were the first signs of this, an example being 900 low-paid staff at Auckland's Sky City Casino who lost their jobs, while the chief executive continued to earn $2,000 to $3,000 an hour, an amount equal to about 150 of those 900 terminated workers. That chief executive earned nearly $4 million in 2019. Mercifully, Unite Union, one of the main working class sort of retail unions, was able to prevent any job losses related to COVID-19 within the fast food industry in New Zealand, though it is an industry that is perpetually aiming to reduce its workforce to nothing as quickly as it can. The same can be said for big box retailers like the Warehouse, which recently took advantage of 2020 to shutter a few of its stores, turning one of its stores in Dunedin into a black site where a skeleton crew shuffles online orders to customers who would pick them up. This was always the plan for this store, but this company took advantage of a time where workers were most vulnerable and took away jobs from hundreds of people to enact their plans of scaling down their physical presence. We cannot just hope that worsening conditions will drive more membership, however. That will not solve things before it is too late. We as workers and unionists everywhere have to go on the offensive to remind the bosses just who is really in charge, who makes the shop run like clockwork, and who really makes the money here. How we do that is simple. We strike. History, even New Zealand history, is filled with examples of long-term sustained strike action getting results, despite the billy clubs and guns shoved in their strikers' faces. It may sound far-fetched or even impossible standing here today, but what we must always encourage is a general strike organized by workers and those under the heel of poverty, who exist in large numbers, in protest at the conditions they and their family must endure while they break their back to make the rich richer. That concludes Angus's contribution. So from here, our organization sees our strategy as three-pronged. Firstly, taking part in popular movements and trade unionism. Secondly, to recruit committed socialists to our cause. And three, to educate our membership in Marxism. Members may leave, and taking part in activism is valuable, but most educated Marxists will hold that education and spark of hope for a better world with them for the rest of their lives. To close off, I'm going to try, if I can, to share. I am not able to share the image of Burns, but at the climate strikes last year, we sort of decorated the statue of Burns with, you might be able to share it now. Let me give it a shot. Here we go. With a Tino Rangatiratanga flag, which is the flag of Indigenous independence in this country.
Very good.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
That's excellent.
Excellent. The flag was stolen by an older white man at some point, but nonetheless, we got photos and it was well celebrated. Let me see if I can stop the share. Cool. Okay, that's me for now. Thank you very much for allowing us the time to talk. Our comrade who was going to share a piece of poetry doesn't seem to be online. The hat was added too. It has a flat. It has a feather in it, which is another symbol of.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Brandon. That was brilliant. What a great way to end our speaker program there with that statue. And I would encourage anybody else present, if you're passing your local statue, stick a sticker on, stick a flag up. Let's show the radical Burns for what he is. So I think a lot of people will be interested in staying behind for some discussion, but I'm conscious that we've went on for an hour and a half and that was the agreed time. So how about if we take a 5-minute break? And if anybody would like to stay for some discussion, they're welcome to.